listening to Brazen Exchange.
Hello. Welcome to Brazen Exchange. I'm your host, Vanessa Imadi. We have come to the end of the series. A big shout out to my guest who came and made this series what it is. Drop your comments below how this series was for you. What were your special moments? We plan to provide insight and just let the world know, okay, this is what Africa is about. This is what is currently happening in Africa. These are thoughts, these are plans, these are the lived experiences of digital workers in Africa. On behalf of my guest, we say thank you for honoring us and honoring this platform. In this final episode, I'll be speaking with a policy expert and economist who can project a map to where we are currently at and what the future of work in Africa looks like. As always, drop your comments below. I am watching for them, I'm reading them, and they gladden my heart always. Stay engaged, stay brazen, enjoy.
You're listening to Brazen Exchange.
I am Joseph Nana. I serve as the chief economist at the Development Bank of Nigeria. In this capacity, I lead research, monitoring and evaluation, sustainability, as well as capacity building. Our overarching objective as a bank is to impact micro, small, and medium enterprises in Nigeria.
In many African countries, digital work is growing. You can see through freelancing, outsourcing, remote work. Even the government is looking to shift towards digital jobs by partnering with foreign countries. In your opinion, do you think that this would help solve the problem of unemployment, or is this simply shifting workers into a more informal and unstable form of employment?
I'll look at it from this lens. You see, if you take a look at the current trends on the continent when it comes to the youth employment and how, if you like, the digital economy is influencing access, if you will, we have to take a look at the resiliency of African youths generally. It is a fragile but resilient subset of people. So, for example, global youth unemployment rate fell to around 13 or 12% thereabout. Whether it's temporary jobs or shifting the dynamics of the jobs. So the way I see it is, in some countries, it's an employer's market. In some countries, it's an employee's market. Meaning that employees can easily say, you know what, I'm going to quit my job today and find work elsewhere. Currently, right now, there are a lot of youths in Nigeria, in Kenya, in South Africa, and other countries, Uganda, are basically working purely remotely for multiple employers. And that is a choice. And while the ILO have defined fully employed as being able to work for a specific hour in a given period, it also implies that the type and quality of the work allows people to essentially move around to different organizations or work multiple jobs in one country for other countries. And that allows you to essentially, in my mind, at least, get a degree of quality, especially if that is the type of job you're looking for. In Africa, generally, we've been known to be an extractive country, agrarian society, largely agriculture, and so on. But nowadays, the influence of the digital economy has allowed, if you like, they coined it platform economy, like digital commerce, gig platforms, whether it's WhatsApp, podcast, if you will, and so on. And this allows people to essentially make and keep their time as they like. So consider high growth sectors within this space, software engineers, digital marketing, data analytics. All of these things could be done remotely. And I'll pivot to the African continental free trade area because it allows, if you will, trade in services, right? And that makes a lot of sense for a lot of youths on the continent, the way I see it at least. But Generally, if you're sticking to the old narrative, oh, I want to work in an office, wear a suit, and go into work and so on, which a lot of youths are still looking for jobs, especially in Nigeria, like that, they're not thinking big enough and they're not being innovative enough. Because in my mind, you, for example, Vanessa, you have a podcast, right? And if you continue the work you do here, you double down, get more guests, and so on and so forth. This could be the next big thing just for you, and you start raking in a lot of money without having to leave the comfort of your living room. So, again, how motivated are youths to work? That's the real question. And what are you willing to do within the confines of the law to attract the types of jobs, given the skill gap in many instances? Because sometimes, by the time you want to go into the workforce, your skills might be stale and you may have to upskill, retrain and so on. But the reality is, the way I see it is, oftentimes some people go to college and study, I don't know, let's say animal husbandry, or let's say name a random course, and there's no jobs out there willing to absorb that person. What does that individual now do? You have to go back and retrain, learn something else, key into your networks, start a podcast, and so on and so forth. There are many ways to skin a cat. And the reality is, we're in the age of artificial intelligence. We're in the age of digital economy. We're in the knowledge-based economy. So it's who is willing to actually innovate, reinvent themselves, and keep on pushing the envelope will get the stability they're looking for in any job and get the dividends of the work you put out there.
I like that you mentioned skills gap because that is a real thing, especially with the advent of AI. The thing you think that you know before, by the time you're ready to apply, AI has already gone like 10 steps ahead of you. So now you have to learn. It's like a continuous cycle of learning. Yeah. So yeah,
Absolutely.
thank you for sharing. Thank you for sharing that. Now, my next question, are African governments ready? Are they prepared to support a digital labor economy through infrastructure, policy, regulation? What are your thoughts?
I think we're already underway. I mean, I mentioned the African Continental Free Trade Area, which is a robust framework that governs terms of trade, goods, as well as services across the continent. But if you look at the policies that have actually been supportive for digital work in particular, we have national strategic frameworks across many countries. For example, we know that the National Digital Economy Policy and Strategy from 2020 to 2030, and of course the 2026 National Digital Economy and E-Governance Bill that establishes standards for digital public infrastructure and literacy. This is cutting across not just East African countries, West African countries, Southern African countries. Chief among them, we have Kenya, who has a digital economy blueprint, which focuses literally on skills development and, of course, data protection. If you think about the continent now on integration, I've mentioned the African Continental Free Trade Area, the Digital Trade Protocol. This is basically currently being domesticated this year, and it's aimed to harmonize broadly standards for e-commerce, electronic signatures, cross-border data flows, and so on. But the PAPS, which is I would like to call it like a subsidiary of African Export-Import Bank, or AfroExim. So that's the Pan-African Payments and Settlement System, PAPS. This organization now literally connects 16 countries and over like 150 banks or so, reducing friction for cross-border digital payments. This is quite key and useful for any type of transaction across various countries. Additionally, now, if you like, AI and emerging technology is quite important. And African countries broadly have already launched national AI strategies to essentially boost productivities in sectors like agriculture and, of course, finance. And let's not forget a plethora of different countries. I know Senegal, Ethiopia, and of course, here at home in Nigeria, they have already begun to operationalize their respective startup acts, which offers regulatory incentives, tax breaks, and of course, institutional support that specifically caters to tech-driven small businesses across those respective countries. So those policies and frameworks are already there, which are quite supportive. Now, the real question is it deep enough? And I think a lot of more work needs to be done because oftentimes we have these policies and frameworks across the continent, but oftentimes it's not really domesticated. It's not really, nobody really knows about it. Or it's not being filtered through the system. That way, we can now hold our policymakers to account, or our public servants to account, and so on and so forth. Because all those things matter. So, but again, there are still policies and factors that still hinder this so-called digital work. And I say this because even though we have these frameworks in place, but we know there's a significant infrastructure and power deficit. So consider unreliable electricity, for example. This remains a major critical barrier. Over 600 million Africans lack grid access. Now, that's beyond grid access. Let's talk about internet connectivity. Just before this call, we've been having connectivity issues. And this speaks to, if you will, some of the hindrances, in my view, that stifle the emergence
Definitely.
and yeah. So these matters, and let's not forget the high costs and taxation. So digital service, whether it's data governance, all of these things, it hinders SMEs and it hinders businesses alike from actually keying into this gig tech or digital economy and so on, because the cost is quite prohibitive, especially internet cost. At home here in Nigeria, we have MTN, we have Glow, Airtel, and so on. But the reality is, even during this call, we've had a bit of glitches, and that shouldn't be. And there are other policies and regulatory uncertainty, or if you will, inconsistencies, especially, but I think of data governance and fragmentation of it. And that's because the laws broadly might be there. It could just be the implementation, just thinking out loud. But economic policy uncertainty, dare I say, has been shown largely to dampen digital economy growth. And this is not just Nigeria. I'm referring to the broader African continent. And it discourages long-term private investments. So once we have a degree of policy consistency, in my mind, when we see it happen and we see it from the judiciary all the way down, then we can begin to say that, okay, perhaps, just perhaps, we're in a state where we can now see private sector keying in, and ultimately these folks now will be the ones to create the jobs, because government doesn't create jobs. Government just creates the environment conducive for the private sector now to create those jobs. There are other issues that we could speak to actually, but let me just close by saying this on this topic, the skills gap, because I've observed there's a significant mismatch between the current education systems and the demand for high level skills in AI, for example, cybersecurity, and even maybe data science broadly. The upskilling of individuals across the country as a continent, we face the risk of offshoring, if you like, offshore migration of local digital jobs, in my mind. So I'll just pause there.
So you mentioned that there are frameworks that exist, but they are not being reinforced, the policies especially, and dealing with the infrastructure problems. This would be a hardship in supporting a digital labor economy. Thanks for mentioning that. Africa is a global source of digital talent. but yet many local economies still struggle with job creation. How can countries benefit from exporting their digital talents without losing long-term value?
If you recall earlier in the show, I mentioned in some countries it's an employer's market, and in some countries it's an employee's market. So, because we are in the gig age or digital economy age or knowledge economy age, whatever you want to frame it as, I read somewhere they called it, if I'm not mistaken, platformization age. And it's just because of platforms everywhere. And
Yeah.
the truth is, if you have tax laws that are implementable, which Nigeria does, thanks to the current tax law that's being enforced right now, you have a situation where no matter where you are in the world, these countries speak to each other. So, for example, now, if you're a US citizen and you are working in a foreign country outside of the US, you're still required to pay taxes to the US, especially if you earn above a certain threshold.
I heard of that.
If you earn, I can tell you for free because I'm the living embodiment of this. So I work here in Nigeria and I still file taxes in the US. And I need to because because by law I have to showcase good citizenry. If you make it below a certain amount, you won't be double taxed. But if you make above a certain amount, you have to pay that liability to the US. For instance, now, Nigeria has essentially, in my mind, adopted the same strategy. So all Nigerians everywhere, you'll be taxed too, theoretically speaking. In my mind, how this relationship works, I think, is that if we have knowledge workers, gig workers, and so on here in Nigeria, and they all have their tax identification numbers, right? Every worker, every individual has an identification number, whether it's your NIN, BVN, you name the acronym, but you have a number in which the tax authorities will capture and say, okay, we have seen these amounts coming into your account. If you can't explain where they're coming from, if it's a salary, then you have to pay X amount depending where you fall in the categorization of employees. Are you a consultant? Are you a contractor? Are you a employee and so on? So there are different buckets and different tax percentages assigned to each category of employee or taxpayer, if you will. So it's a function in my mind of the country having the right framework to capture everybody who is of age. So if the working age is 16 years old, for example, everybody from 16 years old must have a tax identification number or an NIN or a BVN, as it were. That enables government to now capture them in the tax net, which now allows these gig workers to, make foreign FX anywhere in the world and still be in the comfort of their bedroom in Nigeria, for example. And the tax authorities, that's the NRS, the Nigerian Revenue Service, can still be able to deduct the tax required at any point in time. So I think it's the maturity of the country's tax laws and the sophistication of their systems in order to capture these folks. And I think African countries must evolve to achieve this because in the end, I can tell you for free, the developed world do this very well.
I've heard people also complain about that fact and say, okay, they're in Dubai and they're still being taxed. So they're advising people not to even bother going for citizenship in the USA. So you were right when you mentioned that taxation dampens innovation, right? It dampens the digital economy because many people would want to don't want to avoid that.
No,
So
no, no, no. Vanessa, no, I don't think so. I think taxation doesn't dampen innovation. No, I don't. Because hear me out for a second. Imagine a world where you're taxed and you can see where your taxable income is going to. So, for instance, now, you're taxed and you have good roads, you have good public schools, you have public water, you have public utility, and so on and so forth. If you have steady power supply, you have clean water coming into your home, you have good security system and good schools, would you complain about your taxes? The
No,
problem
I wouldn't.
is people complain about the taxes because they don't see it being put to use. They don't
Yeah.
have good public schools. There aren't good roads. In fact, dare I say this, in many instances, individuals have become their own local governments because they have their own
Right.
boreholes in their respective homes. They end up having to have their own generators or buy solar panels to provide the
Some are
electricity.
even
In the
leaking
case,
roads.
some actually fix potholes and fix
Yeah.
roads and so on. So, but in the end, I think because we have a framework now that says we can see where the taxes are going. If we agree this is what the government has collected in taxes, that's across the continent, that each citizen can hold their representative accountable. That's your civil liberty. And I think we have to evolve as a country, as a continent, to come of age, because taxes are not bad. In fact, in every tax system, there are loopholes there. Even in the U.S., there are loopholes there. You name the country, I guarantee you find loopholes there. And people use those loopholes to their advantage. The real question now is this: does taxes stifle innovation? Because in the end, I know you hear billionaires all the time saying they're happy to pay more taxes provided it can reach the people it really needs to help. They say this all the time. Oftentimes, they end up doing CSR. That's corporate social responsibility. And I'm going to adopt a school. I'm going to adopt a highway. I'm going to do this because they don't believe that the taxes is going far enough. So these companies in Nigeria, we have it too. Whether it's commercial banks, development financial institutions, you have the Dangote industries, and so on and so forth. There's so many to go beyond what the government has done because they don't feel the government has done enough in this area because the government is saddled with the responsibility of the whole country. So let's just own a little part and say, this is what we're going to contribute as an organization every year. People do. So I don't think it stifles innovation. In fact, dare I say this, the current policies right now, it's built in where you incentivize businesses. That's why you have tax holidays. You have policies and regulations that give you tax holidays, or if you like, because you are in an infant industry, they want to protect you, so they're not going to bother you, tax you, they allow you to grow. Once you now come of age, maybe after 5 years, they believe, oh, you're solid enough now. We're taxing you. And that's okay.
Okay, okay. Thank you for that education. I believe that it changed my point of view. So, yeah, thank you. So now, on the subject
Okay.
of,
I'm happy. I'm happy.
okay, on the subject of skills gap, right? What changes should governments prioritize in education systems today in order to prepare young people for the jobs that will exist in the next 10 to 20 years?
Skills gap or abound. First of all, the curriculum, it needs to be fit for the 22nd century. Forget the 21st century. You have to think beyond 5 years, think 50, 100 years from now. You have to think big, be bold in your thought process, and you begin to develop your children, the pupils, you name it, in that direction. So, for example, we are in the age of AI and data science. So I can tell you when I did when I was working on my doctorate, I used some analytical softwares to do my dissertation. So there's this statistical package called SPSS. So I use that package to do my quantitative analysis and stochastic analysis accordingly. However, before my era, people were using freehand to do it. In some instances, they were using mainframe computers. Those people who did the PhDs in the 70s and 60s and so on, they were using mainframe computers by IBM. And if you know how those things worked, they had big cartridges like this. and they'll stick it into the mainframe computer. An engineer now runs the analysis, the regression, or whatever. It spits out the results, and hopefully there are no errors, and you now use that and set your typewriter up and begin typing again. Listen to what I'm telling you. I'm talking about a typewriter now. This is the 60s and 70s. Fast forward now. We're now using statistical packages. Prior to that, they were using freehand to compute their analysis. Just imagine how many sheets of paper you have to use to compute your regression analysis and prior to having computers. So what I'm simply saying is that there's a skills gap that needs to be filled, whether it's prompt engineering, algorithm design, and basically to encourage data-driven decision-making, machine learning. So we're talking here about the key digital skills for this year and beyond. Web and cloud infrastructure, I think, is quite useful too. And I say this because we have limited space in all these hard drives. Now everything is going to the cloud, so you need full stack development and managing systems on platforms like AWS or even Azure. You have digital creative arts, that's UX design, content creation, multimedia production. Of course, cybersecurity is key because protecting digital assets is quite critical in this interconnected world we find ourselves. But dare I say this, even though I've mentioned a lot of technical jargon, the truth is soft skills continues to be top of mind anywhere I speak. And I say this because you can have all the knowledge you want, but if you can't communicate this, if you don't have the emotional intelligence to communicate this, to know the nuances about how people respond to different body language or gestures and so on, no matter what you think you know, knowledge is power in theory. Applied knowledge is actually the real power. So when you apply your soft skills, then, Vanessa, I believe the future come more closer to you. And I just feel this way because I've seen a lot of folks who are smart but lack soft skills. So I think those critical things are quite important. And in the end, the way I see it is we live in a globalized environment. So no matter what, we cannot roll back the hands of globalization. It's impossible. A lot of politicians have been trying to do that in different ways. Protectionist stance. There's nothing wrong with having a protectionist stance, especially if you're trying to protect something of natural or national security to your country. But ultimately, we live in a globalized world. The European Union, that's globalization. The North American Free Trade Agreement, NAFTA, that's globalization. African Continental Free Trade Agreement, that's globalization. The Belt and Road Initiative of China, that's globalization. So we are in a globalized world. It's very difficult. Trade doesn't stop. Trade only gets transferred. So if the US stops trading with China, China will find 10, 20 other partners to trade with. If
Yeah, that's
Nigeria,
already happening.
correct. So the reality is, the way I see it, we need to get to a stage where we accept globalization and we work towards the dividends of what globalization means for the African continent. So I don't like hearing stories where an SME from Nigeria is trying to trade with Kenya and going through the West African countries to get to East Africa, he or she is getting taxed at every border. That shouldn't be. That means there's a knowledge gap on the ports. There's a knowledge gap, and we need to fill that gap quickly, because if not, Nigeria will become the dumping ground for all these goods. If not, Nigeria will be on the losing end in terms of trade. I'll close by saying this: nobody gets what they deserve. You get what you negotiate, and if you negotiate favorably, you will continue to grow favorably.
Thank you. I think I need you to speak more on the soft skills that you mentioned because in a previous episode, I spoke with HR and she
Okay?
mentioned soft skills. She said you can have all the skills as well, but she always speaks on soft skills. So, what is it about soft skills that, especially young graduates now, people who are about to go into the workforce, what do they need to know about soft skills and how can they begin to apply it?
When I came into the workforce, the type of people I came in with into the workforce is very different from this generation coming into the workforce. On average, the communication aspects needs to be more professional. So there's a lot of phrases or lingo and just unprofessional type of conversation in meetings that you begin to wonder. You also have ability to adapt. Adapting is so it's survival of the most adaptable. You have to see your environment, know what it is, and you can't say, I'm not going to do this. You have to be able to adapt, get into the system, see why, first seek to understand. So you see why people do certain things and see ways to improve on it, not necessarily kill it. It can be killed over time, but in the near term, understand why it's being done this way. And if there's a way to improve on the process, you do it. That's adaptability. Another thing I hear is teamwork. A lot of times people want to just shine by themselves. I did this, I'm the one who made this presentation, and so on and so forth. But there's no I in team, right? So it's always we as a collective. You have to, there's power in numbers. So if you go as a team and you look at it from a collegial lens, then you do better from that perspective. Another thing I would say is, and I mentioned this already, emotional intelligence. When you walk into a room, there's a way the room might be initially. And you walk in and you may feel uncomfortable at first. The real question you ask yourself is, how do I go into that room and blend in and not feel apprehensive while I walk in? So emotional intelligence means so many different things, but it's like, it's a behavioral, it's an art really. It's really an art because it's like being able to, a performance art. So some people might be naturally introverted. For you to do a podcast, my guess is, Vanessa, you're not introverted.
Well, yeah.
So, so let's assume you aren't introverted, you're an extrovert, and you like to be seen, you like to be heard, you want to get your views out. That's fine. But emotional intelligence will tell us that if you are this person, it's important for you to let others who aren't like that to kind of come through, to shine, project those who are not seen, not heard. Project them, make them feel comfortable, carry them along. That's emotional intelligence, right? So things like that. And that speaks of teamwork, speaks to emotional intelligence, speaks to adaptability, speaks to communication. So it's just a performance art. That's the only way I can really explain it right now, because collaboration is key. Being able to be adaptable is key. Work ethic, soft skills, work ethic. And work ethic means you're motivated. You take initiative. You come to work in a timely manner. You're collegial. You're collaborative. A lot of times we don't have that in the youth coming into the workforce. I'm not saying this for all youths. No. Um, in fact, dare I say, most are quite awesome. But these are the types of traits you would like to see. Soft skills, for me, is of utmost importance, because the hard skills you can learn that. You can learn that on the job. That's teachable. Soft skills is, I wouldn't say it's easily taught. Sometimes they're baked in. They're set in their ways. And it's like the carrot and stick approach. Sometimes you have to use the carrot to incentivize them to do good. Sometimes you have to use the stick to put them back in the right direction again. And that's not just youth, it's everyone. It's everybody. That's why we have consequences for bad behavior. Generally speaking, I think those are the types of soft skills that, in my mind, are required for the next frontier of jobs, especially if we're going to remain in a globalized world. And I think that's critical because working with different cultures, there's obviously cross-cultural differences you will find, and how you can manage to work out different cultural nuances is quite critical. What you might see funny might be a faux pas, like very insulting to a different person who's your colleague of yours in a different part of the African continent. So how do you manage that dynamic? That's why it's important to have good emotional intelligence and soft skills to help, recover if you slip up.
The youth of today, they tell you they're Gen Z and they don't want to do things the way people did in the past. Like, for instance, you come to the workplace, I just want to do my work and go home. Please don't talk to me. Please don't ask me any questions. Just let me do my work and go home. So many of them work with that. I don't want to pretend like this is who I am. Just give me the job, I'll get it done. You're saying it's like a performance art. You have to be able to adapt.
I'm not saying you have to agree with my view on this.
Mhm.
I'm just saying this is the way of the world.
Yes.
Except you're working as a nomad in isolation by yourself and you're self-employed, then I guess it doesn't really matter about collaborating or having to perform. Life, the way I see it, I think it's what you call it is a famous philosopher. Uh, I can't remember his name now. He said life, something to the effect that life is like a masquerade, and he has the sheer misfortune of coming to the party with his face, meaning that he is too real for the fakeness around him.
For the fakeness around, yes.
And I get that. I get that. But if we know, if we accepted that this is the cultural norm, then how do you adapt in order to make the desired change? Change comes from within, oftentimes than without. So if you observe when you want to change a system, it's difficult to be on the outside and affect change on the inside. So typically, if you want to be the president of Nigeria, what do? You campaign, you join a political party, you become an insider, then you become the president at some point, right? Seldomly do you see somebody who has not joined a political party come from outside and he's the president or she's the president. Seldomly do you see that. But typically, the norm is you join a political party, you understand the protocol, and so on and so forth. You get run for it, put your name on the ballot, and over time you get elected, and so on. So change starts from you go from within. I think at least.
You know, there's currently a bill called the Independent Candidacy Bill, and people are pushing for it. So maybe one day you don't have to
No,
join
of
the political
course.
party.
Maybe
Yeah.
I share something with you. In other countries, people run as independents. In the U.S., there are independents in the Senate, independents in the House, I'm probably sure. But overall, you have independents who want to remain independent. But guess what? When you're independent, sometimes you're alone. And like I say, you need a critical mass of like-minded people to affect change. And it's difficult to affect change alone. In fact, you'll be rebuffed and you run out of town. I'm not suggesting that an independent person cannot be president. No, I'm just saying that that independent individual will have to amass that critical following in order to affect the necessary change.
Okay, great, great. Looking ahead, which sectors, like for example, digital sector, manufacturing, green jobs, or even the creative economy, which one do you think will create the most sustainable employment in Africa?
The most sustainable jobs in Africa? That's a good question. I think because Africa needs to key into their strengths, right? And if the strengths are the youth and the strengths are through our natural resources, I think we need to develop, especially for African continental free trade agreement, regional value chain enhancements. So we need to basically develop, or if you will, I'm trying to simplify this. So we have raw materials, inputs, make them intermediate goods and finished goods. We don't have to have all finished goods for all products, but at least take it from inputs to intermediate goods. That way, you've added value along the way. So if we have regional hubs across the continent, say, for example, if Morocco, I'll use Morocco for a good example. Morocco, they're known as the country for exporting vehicles. They manufacture and export the most vehicles on the African continent. In Morocco, I believe they export in excess of 500,000 vehicles per annum. And if that is the case, that is your strength, automotive industry. So the African Continental Free Trade Agreement, we know that that country, that's the specialization. Let's focus on that. I mean, they may have other things, but let's focus on that. For Nigeria, if Nigeria is known for extractive, so mining and natural resources like oil and gas, so let's now do the refineries. That's just one example I'm giving. Of course, there are other examples. Agro-processing. So cocoa. If you think about cocoa, Ghana used to be number one cocoa producers, but raw cocoa is meaningless when compared to what it can convert to. So chocolate, for example. If you ever go to any airport, they always sell chocolates at duty free. Those chocolates are quite expensive. Swiss chocolates are expensive. And dare I say, Swiss, they're not known for producing cocoa, but yet their chocolates are the most expensive. And we consume a lot of those chocolates. So the question now is, how can African countries, Ghana chief amongst them, become a net exporter of finished chocolates or cocoa products, right? And we can go along the value chain like that. So what we need to do is specialization in these key sectors: agro-processing, manufacturing, natural oil and gas, health, and now we go to the tech parts now. Tech, creative economy. There's a lot of digital content out there, which African countries are known for. Nigeria chief amongst them. Once we key into that and make sure we have our patents, trademarks, and so on. That way, we're actually getting the right recognition for it and the right compensation for it as well.
You're listening to Brazen Exchange.
So we're moving to the next segment. It's called Brazen Choices. This is a mini game of Would You Rather. This is where I present two options to you, and then you tell me the one you'd rather go for. So are you ready?
Okay. Sure.
Okay, great. So first one is support digital entrepreneurship or traditional job creation. Which will you go for?
Can I do both? No, I can't do both. Can I do both? No?
No.
Would I rather? Digital entrepreneurship or traditional
job creation.
I'm torn because they both have their benefits. So I don't know. I would say both.
Yeah, play safe. Okay, no problem. The next one, policy for freelancers or policy for digital companies.
Policy for platforms.
The next one, incentives for local tech talents or attracting foreign digital investments.
Local talents.
The next one, short-term digital employment programs or long-term digital economic reforms.
I'll pick B, long-term digital economic reforms.
Okay. And then the last one, focus on digital skills training or digital infrastructure investments.
Infrastructure investments.
Okay. Do you want to explain any of the options that you picked?
Yes, the investments. Human beings, we are primed to follow prosperity. So if there's opportunities in the digital economy, for example, and the government has invested heavily in infrastructure, I guarantee you by the time they hear that, without even seeing it, they're going to get the necessary licenses, training, skills development, and so on naturally. The way I see it, build it and they will come. So if you have a situation where they're investing heavily in, let me give you a typical example. So just imagine in your neighborhood, there is no tarred road. Just imagine that for a second. And the government comes and puts two highways and one flyover. What do you think will happen afterwards?
Well, companies will come here, job will be created, there will be easy transportation, things like that.
Correct. So essentially, you begin to see a gentrification of that neighborhood. Skyscrapers might come there. If it's a suburban part of town, you see people building better, sophisticated houses. You see schools coming in. A multiplier effects of jobs already happens because a road passed through a town. That's why I say build it and they will come. So if you invest heavily in the digital infrastructure, I guarantee you hundreds of thousands of youths will go get the necessary training and certification required to capitalize and benefit from the infrastructure being built. If you're to skill the youths, for example, without the infrastructure, they're going to leave the country.
We're already doing that.
I know. That's why I said that. So, but imagine if there was an infrastructure there already. They won't leave anywhere. They will be here and still achieve the same objective because they can work for companies in the US, the UK, Australia, you name the country, and earning an FX and staying in the comfort of their homes where the cost is more manageable than going there, where it's more expensive.
Okay, I don't know if you're the right person to ask this question, but I want to add one more brazen choice for you. Relocation abroad or local opportunities? Which would you go for?
I'm not the right person for this question. I'm not. It's not a fair question to me because I've been abroad my whole life. So I've now relocated to Nigeria, and I've been here for several years. I go back and forth, obviously, but I'm not the right person for that question.
I guess your case is the case of reverse Japa. People who
There you
were
have
over
it.
there and then came back. Should African governments focus more on creating jobs or regulating digital work or preparing their citizens to create their own opportunities?
Governments don't create jobs, so the first option is out. They create the environment for a private sector to create jobs. So I think they should focus on number three, perhaps.
Preparing their citizens to create their own opportunities. That's the one you're
Yes,
going for.
which
Okay.
which means that to achieve this, they have to put the infrastructure and create the enabling environment. That's what I'm reading from that option, at least.
What is your hope for the future of work
Uh-huh.
in Africa?
My hope for the future of work. Honestly, my hope for the future of work, my hope in general, as far as work is concerned, is everybody who wants a job can get a job. Because when you have a decent job, I believe wholeheartedly you will behave a certain way. You become more responsibility, you become more socially conscious, and you demand more from the government. You expect to see certain things. And because of that, it becomes an age of enlightenment. So, in my hope and aspiration is everybody who wants a job can get a decent job that takes care of themselves and their family.
And that's all for this session. I really appreciate your time. Thank you so
Sure.
much.
My pleasure. You take care.
This series was funded by Africa No Filter. The stories and conclusions shared within are those of the host and guest and do not necessarily reflect the positions or policies of Africa No Filter.
Thank you, Africa No Filter and Ford Foundation. This grant has given me the opportunity to step out of myself and examine the world through a microscopic lens, through the lives of different professionals, the HR, the tech worker, policy, the lawyer, the hybrid worker, the gig worker. Seeing the future of work through those lenses has really expanded my worldview, and I hope that it expanded yours as well. A kind teacher once told me, "Why must all good things come to an end?" So this is not goodbye. This is, like the Spanish would say, hasta luego. And that is all that I got from Duolingo. So hasta luego. See you later.